Okay. All right. So now if I refresh, here is our code. And it's still doing npm install. It's almost done. A lot of stuff here. All right. So I can run npm run dev. And when I open the application on my computer, this is not the right application because I'm using a service worker. For those of you from last night, probably know what a service worker is now. So for cache stuff, there we go. All right, so we have our login page. We had home page, and we also, I believe, we had it. So I'll use test@test.com, password test. We had it so that it will log in. The only thing that I thought we had this going. When we log in, we changed this to saying log out, but maybe we didn't end up doing that. But what we're going to do is kind of similar to what we've done in a previous week, except now we're going to be doing it with React. We're going to be creating some data, mlab. Let's see, sign in. Week 6. Okay. So we had some accounts and we had classes. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually hook that up to being able to use the exact same data that we used in a previous week. So that way when we hook it up, we can see that we've properly requested the information that we're going to be using. So in here we have our accounts, and then we also have our classes. So the first thing that we need to do is change our connection string to using the correct one. So I'm going to open up my editor. Right here. Opening up our server, going into not there. Maybe it's, oh, we didn't actually create any stuff with mongoose. That's right. Okay. So what we're going to do first is actually install mongoose. So first, I'm going to type in npm install. I'm going to font size npm install -- save mongoose. It's going to do its installing. While that's happening in the background, I'm going to take our models from week 6, which is when we did this. So instead of just having to recreate it, unless if you guys need a little bit more explanation on how to do the models. Oh, there it is. So we need a class. Well, I guess we're using all those. That's right. Yeah. So, all right. So inside of our server, because the models are not going to be used on the front end, we're going to be creating our folder for our models under server. So we're going to create a new folder called models. And in here, we had person.js. We had class.js. And we had one other, which is program.js. So I'm just going to... Yes, so it goes source, server, models. So I needed program. And I'm going to put in the class. And I also need the person. Actually, is that the first one that I did? No. Okay. So we have our person, we have our class, and we have our program. So just as a quick refresher, I'll start at the very bottom where we have a program. So a program, oh, I copied person into program, whoops. Okay. Yes, yeah. So I'll just git add that, git commit creation of models, and git push that up. So just to quickly give you a refresher, we have our program schema, and what that consists of is a name and a code. So this would be, you know, like computer programmer analyst, and its code is COPA. So this is just the program that someone would be in. We also have a person, and this consists of a first name, a last name, a student number, and also a program. So the schema that we have for program is going to be nested inside of program. So kind of, if we did it, showed you a JSON representation. So I'd have a first name of Chris, a last name of Naismith, a student number of 2003-02445, and then I would have a program, and this takes on the shape of program. So we also have a name and a code. So then we have name, which is computer programmer analyst, and its code is COPA. So I'm just going to do this as, actually I'm going to remove the part that says example and throw that as a comment, and then example output. So this is what right now our person looks like. Then inside of class, this has a name for the class, it has a course code, it has a term, and then it has, instead of inside of our person, where its program is just programmed by itself, meaning that there's only going to be one program that a person is in here we actually have an array going around the person. And that means that our students is going to be an array of people, as well as our instructors can also have numerous persons teaching it. So, and then if we quickly shaped this one out, we would have a name of advanced server-side scripting, a course code of COMP2106, a term of winter 2019 students, and I'll just use a ... I'm sure you can understand what's in the students, and then instructors, the same thing. I'm going to comment that out and have an example right there. Is there any questions that someone has about those three models right now? No. So after adding my comments, I'm just going to add comments to models and push that up. Behind this one. All right, so now to use those models on the front end, we're going to have to create an API in order to do that. Actually, the first thing that we have to do is we have to include Mongoose into our server so that it's able to connect to it. So in here, I'm going to use const mongoose equals require mongoose. And then I'm going to do mongoose.connect with our connection string. And I'm going to get that from here. And we need a DB user and password. Under users, I have the user. I don't know what the password is, so I'm just going to create a new one. Test with the password test and the password of test. Password must be just 6 characters long, so I'm just going to use the password 1 numeric 1 1, which is probably actually what I ended up making it before. So the password here is going to be password 1 1, or I think it's just password 1. And now I do db equals mongoose.db. db. Let's see. Let's just grab it from this week as well. Just double check. Oh, that's right. We also need that new URL parser so that we don't get yelled at for using the old version. And it's db. I'll just copy this. So we create a variable called db, which is a reference to our mongoose connection. And then on an error, we're going to console log that there was a connection error. Otherwise, on the first time that it connects, we're going to say that we're connected to mongodb, which, if I stop that and restart, there we go. So it says that we're connected up here, that we're connected to MongoDB. So just to let you know that right now, a lot of the stuff that's being spit out into our is going to be a lot of stuff that's done from Webpack. And what Webpack is what compiles all of our React code into a more generic format so that way it can be used across multiple different browsers. Because a browser doesn't understand just the React code that we're writing. So if we go into api.index.js, we're now going to have to change our login from just using a email and password that's right here to actually using our, we're going to need actually, sorry, to create a model first to being able to log in. So we need to create one more model, which I'm going to take from probably week 8. So models, account, and I will also push this up onto GitHub once I create it. So account.js. And I'm going to have to install Passport and Passport local mongoose. So npm install passport local mongoose --save. And git add that, git commit account model / passport install, git push. Okay. So now inside of our login, we can now import our account model that's under our models, and then being able to try to log in with Mongoose. So we're going to have to create a variable called account, which will require in our models / account. And then in here, we're going to account.find1. And we're going to give it where the email, actually, sorry, where the, what is it here? Where the username is the email that was given. And then we're going to chain off of it. We're going to say account. And we're going to just comment this out here. So res JSON account. and sorry, request.body.email. Okay. So as you guys are aware with Mongoose, what we're doing is we're importing our account and then we're using the find one. So this will return us the first account that matches where its username is going to be the email that we're giving it in the body object. So right now we're just returning whatever is found and using res.json on it. If it does not find an account, this account here is going to probably just be null. Because it will mean that it did not find an account. So we can handle that after to give either a successful or unsuccessful response. But right now we just want to make sure that this is working as expected without any sort of errors. So we open up our login form, which I'm actually going to now change. Actually, I think do believe we're already console logging the value that comes back. No, we're not. Okay. So console log data, and I want to change this to just being data here. The reason why I do this is what is called destructuring. The response that comes back from Axios contains a couple different pieces of information, which I showed you last week. It has a status code, which there are a bunch of different status codes that are out there, but what we're expecting back is like a 200 response code. Whereas there is the data object that's inside of it, and that's everything that we will end up using inside of our res.json. So that is what is sent back from the server as a response. In some cases, it can be HTML, it can be JSON, it can be JavaScript, it can be XML, it can be really whatever you want to return back. So all I want to do is I want to see what that response is, and then I just want to console log it. So if I just refresh this, I'm going to try the email of test@test.com with a password of test and click submit. So I'm going to guess that that was successful because you can see right here is here's the username and our ID and everything else. Let me turn this off, go to login. But if I tried to do something else, so let's say not valid at test.com, and then give a password of test again, and I click submit, we actually get back null. So right now it is redirecting to our index page because we're always returning back a successful response on the server. So what we want to do is when we check if that user exists, if it doesn't exist, what we want to do is we want to then return back saying that that user does not exist. There is one thing that I also want to say is that we are not right now doing anything for checking with the password. We're only checking with the email as of right now. So just to see if that works. So if I did test@test.com, and I put in all this random gibberish and click submit, you'll see that we still get back our user. So that's not a correct password checking. In order to do that, sorry, under routes, index, not that one. Okay, so we can do the passport authenticate. We're in our app.js, where we include our passport for session management and everything like that. So I'm going to install that. So that way it works. npm install save express session and also passport local. And that's going to install that. So just to maybe clarify if it's not clear what the difference between session and passport is while that installs. So express session, what it ends up doing is it keeps information on the server of who is logged in the application. So when you log into an application, it's able to recognize your device in, through different things. You can either use cookies or you can use headers and all that sort of stuff to basically know who is who. So that way the next time that you come back to the application, you're still logged in. Whereas Passport is what is used for the authentication to then add that information into the session. So I'm going to copy those in. And what is important is the order in which we add it to our application. The reason being is certain things depend on other things to already be set up. So up here where we're importing it, that part doesn't really matter. We can import it in whatever order that we want. But when we initialize it in our application, that is the part that matters, because we want, if Passport is going to be hooking into Express, we need to have initialized our session before we can use Passport with it. And then, of course, same thing with our using Passport, because we're using it with Mongoose. We want to make sure that we have already connected to Mongoose before we try to use our Passport with it. So that's a little important to know. So what we need is to set up our session, which I will put right here. We're going to have secure of false because we're not using HTTP. We need to use Passport initialize right here. So we need to initialize Passport, and then we say that we want to use Passport session. And that is where we want to make sure that we have already actually used our session above it. And then the only other thing that we need to do is include our Passport strategy that we have used inside of our model. So we want to include that. Good. We're going to copy serialize and deserialize user, which is for basically handling everything for like Passport security and stuff like that. So that's why we're serializing and deserializing the user and then making it recognize in Passport globally from our account. And we can get rid of that. And last thing is our login, which is right here. So in here, where's person? No, right here. So we can just use const passport equals require passport. Okay, so if hopefully this looks a little familiar. So when we had originally set up Passport, we had a success redirect and a failure redirect. However, because we're going to be using React, we're actually not redirecting on the browser side. We're not redirecting on the server side. We need to be able to handle that on the browser in the client using React. So instead of using a success redirect and a failure redirect, we now need to handle what is sent back to the user so that the client can then figure out what it needs to do upon a successful message. So just going to go into Passport authenticate. Authenticate local. We don't need to redirect. I think it's just if it manages to get here, if this function gets called, authentication was successful, and request.user contains the authenticated user. Okay, so what this will do is it'll return back saying that, yes, it was successful. So we can get rid of this part that's right here and just use passport authenticate local. And then we need to use request, response, and next. OK. So I'm going to console log our request.user, and then I'm still going to respond back with our request.user that came from passport. So now, inside of our application, if I refresh this, uncaught exception, account model, cannot overwrite account model once compiled. There we go. So refresh that one more time. So now if I go to the login, and I log in with something that does not work, so, well, first let's make sure that an account that we have an email address for, but we enter in the wrong password, when we click login, we get an error. So in this case, it came back with a 400 request. So we know that that did not successfully work. But if we use just test and we click submit, that also did not work. So let's check. Maybe we use password. Nope. OK. Nothing there. Cool. So we don't need the client open right now. We have our account with passport local mongoose. That's all working. Passport authenticate local. That should all be set up correctly. Let me just restart the server just in case. So that's all connected. Refresh. Test at test.com. Test. Does not work. So if we look at mlab, we have collections, accounts, and that's all set up with that. OK. Great. Password, test, 1, 2, no, OK. So I'm going to guess that our API is just not working correctly. So we do a post request to our login. We try to authenticate with that. I'm going to set up this request res next. You can ignore this part. And console.log request.body. And then I'm going to use next. So as I've mentioned, you can set up, well, this is a middleware right here, but what this is going to do is it'll hit this block first when we post to our login, and I'm just going to console log out request.body, and then I say next so that it can go on to the next part in the step, in this case being passport authenticate local, and then it should, upon success, go to here, but it does not look like it's wanting to do that. So refresh this one more time. Oh, I bet you it's because this is using email instead of username, if you guys remember that from a couple weeks ago. So it's expecting it in this to be username, which means this becomes username, this becomes username, and inside of our pages for login, we also need to have username set up there. Let's just look for email. OK. Let's try that one more time. So test at test.com. test, submit. There we go. So it did come back with it successfully. So I'm going to git add that and change email to username and push that up. So now if I were to try to log in with a different person, so let's do not valid at test.com with a password of test, and I click submit, we get back an error of 401 not authorized. So this will automatically respond back with a 401 status code to let us know that the request was not successful. So anything that I enter in that does not work. If I add test at test.com with a wrong password, it also does not work. I'm still getting errors right here. You can see it incrementing. So inside of our API, I can now just remove this. And I'm going to respond back with a success of true. Let me shrink that a little bit. There. So add in a comment. So use passport to authenticate using our account model. Upon success, res.json returns success of true. If there's a failure, automatically returns 401 error. Okay. So now that we've set this up, when I click test and click submit, it now moves us to our index page. And the reason is in our login, right here in our, this is our Axios call to log in. It sends our username and password, and then it says this.history.push. So history, you can think of where your browser currently is. And pushing is, because history is an array, so you can see all your past history in here. When we push into it, we're actually basically saying that we want to go to this location. So that's what this is doing right here. So redirect on success. And then we have a .catch, which is when it fails, we end up doing this .set state error of true to show that there is an error message when logging in. So the only issue with this is that our application globally does not know that we have successfully logged in. So if I open up our nav bar, we can see that we still have the login, and I can still log in even though I already have successfully logged in. So when we handled this in Pug, what we would do is we would check if request.isAuthenticated, and then we would either display the login page if they're not authenticated, and we would be able to display the logout page if they are authenticated, login if they are not. So, but because request.isAuthenticated is on the server, we actually can't access that on the client. So what we're going to do is we're going to store it locally upon the success message. We want to store that in our application. So inside of our app.js, we can store a value of is logged in. So we're going to write a constructor that has props and super props. And then we're going to have this.state. And that's going to have a value of is logged in of false. So right here, I'm just going to log out this.state.is logged in .toString. So at the very top, I'm going to remove that out of, just going to throw a div right here. Okay. So if I refresh, a writer may only have one child element. So that should be fine now. Refresh again. Okay. So you can see that it says false for us being logged in. And when I log in, nothing changes. So our application right now when we log in, as you guys know, is not able to detect a successful login. We know inside of our, and maybe it's going to take a quick second to explain this. So communicating stuff in React can be a little bit confusing. So everything is a top-down approach. So who here remembers like history class and learning about like First Nations people? So back way when, everything that you learned growing up was directly from your parents. And their parents learned from their parents learned from their parents, and you have this top-down model. So everything that a component knows can only come from stuff that is above it. So in this case, our login component is rendered from our app. So in order for anything in our application to know that if it's logged in, this is why we have to store the state inside of our app. As of right now, the code that we've set up in our login page, we do an Axios request where we log in, and then upon success, we end up changing to the index page. And we just console log what's there. So in order to have our application know if we're logged in or not, we have to give our login page the ability to change that value. Because I can't, in the login component, just without setting it up, I can't just say, hey, application, we're logged in, just don't worry about it. So what we're going to do is inside of our app.js, we're going to write a function that's called handle login success. And all that's going to do is set this, it's going to do this dot set state of is logged in, and it's going to be setting it to true. That's the only thing that it'll do. And because we're referring to the this keyword, we're going to have to bind our function. So we do this dot handle login success equals this dot handle login success dot bind dot this, which I know is very verbose. There are ways that you can avoid binding, but we're not going to go over it just because it is a little bit more of an advanced concept and is not, you end up having to use Webpack with stuff to allow you to do it because it will change your code through the compiler. But anyway, so handle login success will set our state of logged in being true. So we actually haven't rendered a component in a route without using component before. So I mentioned that there's 3 different ways that you can render a component. You can just say, here's the component. The other way, if you want to manually be able to specify properties that you want to share with it, you can use the render method. So on our, well, actually right now, yeah, sorry. So on our login, we want to use render instead of component, so we're just going to get rid of it. And that takes a function. So in here, it gives us value of props. Really, you can name it whatever you want, but we're going to use props. And then we say that we want to render our login, and we want to put all the properties that are given to us, and we want to give it the handle login success of handle login success. This dot handle login success. So our route is going to render this instead of using this component. Is that a question or just scratching? Just scratching. All right. Does anyone have a question about that? About using render instead of component? If you're wondering when you have to do it, it's when you want to use specific props on that component. So these props that are right here are the properties that would automatically get passed on to our component. So this is going to handle like our routing information. If I open up the React DevTools, it might be a little bit easier to show you. So our index, it gets 3 properties that are given to it. It's given a history property. This is what we're using to change the location of our application. It has a location property that contains like the path name of where you are. If you had like any, it has search. So if I were to have some stuff like test equals true and reopen that, you'll see under index and location, we now have our search parameters right here. There's also a hash, which doesn't really matter. And then there's also a key. So, and then the last other thing that is shared is, oh, there we go, is match. And this is the information that the router is using to know is like a matched route. So we have isExact, we have the parameters. So if we were using something similar to in our application using like IDs, I could put in an ID route that would use the parameter. So now we're wanting to pass a function of handle login success. So inside of login, we now know that we have a value that's called, it would be under this .props .handle login success. So if I click on here, you can see it right here. So our props handle login success, and it is a bound function. So upon a success, I just want to do this .props .handle login success. And that's it. I'm going to actually completely remove this part here where we're changing the history. And I don't care about the data. So if I refresh, you'll see now we won't actually change to the index page because I just removed that. But what does happen is our value that's at the top that's false, when I log in successfully, it now gets set to true without having to refresh anything on the page. So with this, we're now able to determine across our application what parts we should be showing. So let me close off some of these things that we're not using. Close, close, close. So I'm going to save this right now. So change value of is logged in app upon success. And push that up. So now inside of our app, instead of, oh, I guess, yeah, maybe I'll just add that back in. What I was going to do is, instead of handling the pushing to index inside of our login page, I was actually going to move it inside of app and handle everything inside of handle login success. The only issue with that is our app component doesn't actually have the props of history to change something. So in this case, we actually can't do that. So I'm just going to keep that as is. Git add back in redirect. Git push. Okay. So now, if I log in one more time, test@test.com, password of test, submit. Now we're logged in. So this is now where we can start changing our UI based off of if we're logged in or not. So I'm going to actually take this as a good spot to pause, and we can just go on a 10-15 minute break. You're welcome to go to the hot dog cart. So, all right.
Will you watch us? Probably.
Okay, so now we're going to be setting up the creation of our classes. So we're going to use some pretty similar stuff to what we used on when we had written it in Pug, but in this case we're now going to be writing it, of course, in React. So in order to view our classes, we're going to have to make a classes.js page. And we're going to import React from React. We're also going to import our layout from and go back to components and grab layout and const classes equals this return layout. So classes. And then export default classes. And then in order to actually use our classes page inside of our app, we're going to copy this. And in our component, we're going to say classes on /classes. And import our classes from here. So now in our application, if we go to /classes, we can see here that we're now rendering the correct component. The only other thing that we need to do is inside of our nav bar, if I shrink this so it's an actual nav bar, we need to add classes into here. So inside of navbar, I'm going to add another nav link that says classes, and that goes to /classes. So now we can just switch between them. But you'll notice that if I log in, I do test@test.com. When we successfully log in, we change our state to saying that we are logged in. And it says true, but when we refresh the application, we're not logged in again. And that's because anything that's in state persists when you're currently on the site, but then the moment that you leave the site, it's not there anymore. So what we could do, there's a couple different ways that we could handle this. Whoops. But inside of our server, let me just close everything so as not to confuse them. Inside of our server under index, we have login, but what we could also do is we could have a get of is authenticated. And in here, all we're going to do is use our request res next, and we're just going to do res.json logged in is request.is authenticated. That's it. So we're just going to respond back that either yes, we're authenticated, or no, we're not authenticated. So if I were to open this in our application under /API /is authenticated, and right now it's saying false. But if I go to here, I type in test@test.com and log in, and I refresh it, it now says true. And the reason for this is right now, every single time that we restart the server, we lose all of our session information. However, when we restart just Express, so if I were to change something in our page that say classes page, This will recompile it, but when I refresh, in here it's going to say false because we're not checking it. But in here, oh, it did restart it. That wasn't supposed to happen. Am I ignoring that folder? Hold on, give me a sec. Okay, so if I make a change to this, oh, okay, it is registering that as a change. So, 1 second. I'm going to create there's a file that you can create that's called nodemon.config, although sometimes it's also in your package.json, but it's not. I'm just going to put it in package.json. So, nodemon.config. What you can do is you can say that you want certain parts of your application to ignore. So because nodemon is only used for restarting Node, we only want to trigger it when something in our server happens, not in our client, because the client can be updated without anything changing in the server. So in this case, under package, I want to have our nodemon config. I'm going to remove the delay. But what we want to do is under source/client, and then everything that's under client, using a star for wildcard, we want to ignore that folder. We also want to ignore everything under node modules. We want to ignore everything under build dev. And we want to ignore everything that is a log file. So a double star is like a wildcard for all of that. So just to explain this one more time, so nodemon right now is watching everything that's inside of our project, and we need to make it so that if something changes under client, our node modules, our build dev, which is right here, and **.log, we do not want to restart nodemon. But in order for that to take effect, we have to restart nodemon. So, so now, if I change a file, so change this to being test and save it, Webpack will rebuild, but you'll see that nodemon did not restart, which actually was probably causing an, no, it's still not, is it? Okay. I was thinking that maybe hot module reload was going to be working, but it doesn't look like it. Yeah, okay. That's too bad. Hot module reload is super helpful, but is not really. Oh, hold on. Maybe let's try this now. So under classes, so this right now is saying test, and I change this to classes page. Remove that T. There we go. So now, as we're developing, we can change our application and change this to saying example. So when I change it on the right side, let me just collapse this just so it's easier. So you can see right here we have our classes page. I save it. It immediately changes. So now I could wrap this in a div with a class name of container and throw the text inside of that. Save that, and now it automatically indents it. So this is actually one benefit of using a client-side library is as you make changes to it, in the same way how React will make changes as something happens without having to refresh, you can also develop like that as well. So you can just make changes on the fly however you want. So in this case, I could take what we currently have and I could paste it inside of it. So we have two layouts, and I could just keep doing that over and over again. So with any issues, we're able to just change on the fly. So that's really helpful. So I'm going to remove this div that's right here for console logging. If we're actually, no, I'm going to keep it because now we're going to implement that checking that we're logged in. So I don't think anywhere we've used this yet. Okay. So this is actually pretty important, and I was actually holding off until today to do it. So React has what are called lifecycle methods. So in the same way that instead of directly changing state, we use a function that's called this.setState, React has lifecycle methods for being able to detect when things change, which is kind of the whole point. Because we don't always just want to change the user interface right away when something changes. Sometimes we want to detect that something changes and maybe change the entire UI in itself. So let's say, I don't know if you guys have ever seen on certain sites that have like a theme. Sometimes they'll have like an option to change the color on the site. So it could be yellow, and then you click like a dropper and you change it to purple, and now the entire theme is using purple. It's not just one purple. It has changed the entire theme across the site. So you could do something like that in React, where when that property changes, you could change the entire global theme of the site. So where's the part where it mentions it? Life cycle. Okay. So there is a whole slew of different lifecycle methods that you can use. The most common that you will probably need to use is something like component did mount or component will unmount. So who here can maybe quickly explain just what a constructor is? It can be as bad of an explanation as you want. I'm probably still going to go off of it. I bet I could. Yeah, I mean, that's not wrong.
Method that creates an object based on model or class you have.
Yeah, it's pretty close. So kind of actually a bit of both. So a constructor is, think of it like a function that is ran when you are generating a new thing of that. So in this case, we have a clock. If we wanted to create a new clock, the constructor method would run, and it sets this.state, and it gives it a value of date as a new date, which would equal basically what the current date is. So if you generated a clock right now, and then you generated a clock in 5 minutes, it's not going to have the same date property. So that code that is in the constructor is ran when you create it. Now the thing is in React, when you're updating stuff, that constructor doesn't get run again. It's only run the first time when it's created. So in this case, think of the constructors run first, and then after we display that component on the screen, we end up running component did mount. And that means that the component has been created and we've now displayed it on the screen. So inside of our classes, or let's do it on the index page. So I'm going to use a constructor and super props and console log constructor right here. And then I'm going to use also component did mount. So you'll notice something that I didn't actually have to do here. Does anyone notice what I did in component did mount that I had to do, let's say, with handle login success? Does anyone See the small difference? So we have handle login success. It's a function, and this does this.setState. And then here we have component did mount. It's doing console.log, but I still could do this.setState if I wanted to. We did not have to bind it. That's correct. So all lifecycle methods that come through React are automatically binded. So you can actually use any of the this.setState properties without having to bind it in your constructor. So, and the reason why that happens is when we extend off of react.component, component is already binding those to the component. So with us extending off of it, we don't actually have to do that, which is just handy, kind of makes it a little bit easier. And then the other lifecycle method I was going to use is component will unmount, and I'm going to console log component will unmount. And there's also some other ones that I'll throw in here. So component will update, console log component will update, component will receive props, console.log component will receive props. I say that's a good amount for now. So I'm going to open up the console. And I'm going to go to the index page. And you'll see here that we ran the constructor first, and then we had component did mount. So, but nothing has changed in here. And component will receive props. If we open that up, oh, it's now been renamed to unsafe component will receive props because it's not used anymore like that. So let's try that one more time. So does it explain? So yeah, so is invoked before a mounted component receives new props. If you need to update the state in response to prop changes, for example, to reset it, you may compare this.props and next props and perform state transitions using this.setState in this method. That sounds kind of confusing. But basically, if in, let's say, app, we need to know in our index page when is logged in changes. So in here, in our index page, we're going to render out our index page. So is logged in, is logged in. Oh, this dot state dot is logged in. Okay. So in here, it's now received props as a props change. So we're able to see when something changes. Now, the one thing that we haven't done is you'll see that did mount has not changed. So let's actually do one other thing. I'm going to set interval every second and say this dot set state is logged in, prev state is logged in. Okay, so what this is going to do is roughly every second, hopefully, component did mount, toggle state. I'm just going to move this into a function, so toggle state, and then I'm going to bind toggle state. and set interval this dot toggle state every 1 second. So refresh that. Okay. So you'll see right now we're toggling back and forth, is logged in at the very top. So false, true, false, true. And you'll see that we keep getting our lifecycle methods are firing. So in here, in our, there's will update, and there's also a component did update. So I'm just going to paste this component did update, throw that in. So you'll see now did update is firing right here. I'm just going to log it as an info, if that will change it. Probably not. Console.warn. We'll throw it in as a warning statement just so it stands out a little bit more. So you can see right here that we're using component did update, and it gives us access to prev props, and it gives us access to the previous state of the component. So a component will update if either its props have changed or its state has changed. So in here I can console log the prev props, and I can also console log this dot props. So you can see right here that we see is logged in at the top is false or true, and then the one below it is the opposite. So if I bump, can you see that at the back? You can see it changing right here. Yeah, cool. So this obviously isn't pretty representative of an application is not going to toggle between true or false all the time, but understanding how the different lifecycle methods is important. So in this case, the only one that still hasn't happened is you'll see that we haven't ran will unmount. So when I go to a different page, so right now all of these lifecycle methods are in the index. So when I go to classes, you'll see that component unmounts. And none of those lifecycle methods are being hit anymore because it's not on the page. Once I go back to home, you'll see that they start getting hit again, and I go back and they're not there. So understanding how the lifecycle methods work can be pretty important if there's information that is specific for what's there. Like sometimes, let's say you have a page that is for a specific class. Well, if for some reason the class changes, you need to be able to then grab that proper class information. So I'm going to shrink this down. And yeah, okay. So the reason why we were going over the different, oh, sorry, yeah.
Is the state supposed to be changing on the top right? On top left side?
Yeah, because I haven't like refreshed it. If I refresh it, it'll stop doing that. So it had set a set interval that was already running it, so that had been triggered to constantly update it, but I just hadn't refreshed to remove it yet. So thank you. But the reason why I was showing these lifecycle methods is when we mount the application, this is where we're going to want to make an API call to check if we're already authenticated in our application. So on component did mount, we want to use Axios. So I'm going to import Axios from Axios. So I'm going to do axios.get, and I want to do it to /API/is authenticated, and then I'm going to .chain on it and use data console.log data. So let's just refresh. So is logged in is false right now. If I log in, so test.test.com, password test, you'll see that we still didn't run the did mount because we're running this in our application. Traditionally, in your application, it will only mount once. There's not a reason to unmount your application. But if we refresh and we check, is logged in is true. So now what we want to do is just set our is logged in value to being what is there. So we can now just set this dot set state and use is logged in is equal to data dot logged in. And it would probably make more sense inside of our server to just use the exact same terminology. So I'm just going to use is logged in just to make it easier. So this is logged in. So now when I refresh that, so it's still going to be false because now we just changed the server, so we lost our session. So we log in one more time, so test.test.com. And now it's true. And if we refresh our application, it says false right at the very beginning, but then it says true. And the reason for that is when we initially mount our application, we have to check if we are, it's defaulted to being false, and then afterwards, then we set it to true. What we could do is set is logged in to being null, meaning that we don't know the value if you're logged in or not. And null does not have a value of toString. So what I'm just going to do is this dot state dot is logged in is not equal to null. Then we want to do this dot state dot is logged in, mistype that, dot toString. So in this case it's true. And if we change the server, I'm just going to type in another thing. If you need to manually restart, you can just type in rs and hit enter, and it will restart nodemon. But now, when we restart, you'll see that it's false. And then when we log in one more time, it sets it to being true. So we can actually just get rid of that because now we know that this is working correctly, and just leave it out of our application. But what we do need to do is inside of our classes, we need to make sure that you can only get to classes if you are authenticated. And this is where it can start to be a little bit annoying, is because we need to pass is logged into our classes. Well, something else that you can do, and this gets to be a little bit repetitive, is our layout component is what well, first we have our page that renders our layout, and layout renders our navbar, and navbar is where we have all of our information for the different pages that we can go to. And what is annoying about that is if we need to pass the value of is logged in to our navbar, we have to pass it to every single one. Traditionally, that's what is called prop drilling. So again, that whole idea of the parent passes to the child then passes to that child, and so on and so forth. But there's another way that you can do that using what is called the context API, which is a little more advanced. It's a way that you can like skip that, and I think we're just gonna not go over that because it is a pretty advanced concept. Or would you guys just rather me just do it and maybe I can just say like just don't use it? This is going to be the last class that we're using React anyway, so I can just show it to you guys. Okay. So React has a function that's called react.createContext, and it has a default value of what you can give to it. So in this case, inside of our application, actually I'm going to create it outside. I'm going to create a file that's called appcontext.js. I'm going to create app context. I need to import React from React. And const default value of is logged in is null. And then export default app context. So as I said, you import React. This is going to be the default value of our context. We create it, and then we export what we just created. So inside of our app, we can now import this in and just say import app context from app context. And then inside of our application, I'm just going to replace this div with appcontext.provider. And then down here, appcontext.provider. So this will now wrap my application with something that has the value. If I open up the React DevTools again, we have our app container, we have app, browser router, and then you see this context provider. So the context provider is what will be providing the information to our component. And then now, inside of our, where is it? Inside of our nav bar, we need to know if, we need to know in our nav bar if we're logged in or not. We don't need to pass it to every page. So we can import app context from and go back to app context. And then inside our nav bar, the only part that needs to know is right here in our settings. So we can just do appcontext.consumer this time and move our stuff into there. Actually, I'm going to move it up one just to make it a little bit easier, because app consumer uses a unfortunate pattern that makes it harder to work with of called render props, which I think I've already briefly touched on. So in here, we end up using a function. So this comes with basically our values. And then from there, we want to render this. I know it's a little bit confusing. But what we can do is just say, I'm just going to log out values, or JSON, because it's going to be a JSON object. So JSON stringify our values. And this will be did that not attach properly? Hold on, let's see. So consumer value, render something based on the context value. Oh, I don't think I have it in here. So I'm going to remove these. Value equals is logged in is null. This dot state dot is logged in. Okay. So now, there we go. So now in our in our nav bar, we can now see what our current value of is logged in without having to pass that that value and state as props to each individual component in the list. So this just makes it a little bit easier, but it increases the complexity because you don't actually see it being passed down. Is that a question? No. Okay, sorry. Is there any questions about what I've kind of done right now? Yes. Yes. Okay. I'll put a comment in some places. So right here, create context provider that sets a value of is logged in equal to our state value of is logged in. So that's what's happening right there. And then inside of our nav bar, uses our app context located inside app.js and grabs the values from it. So in this case, the only thing that we need to worry about is logged in. And in this case, we're just going to do, if we're logged in, we want to go to here. Otherwise, we want to go to here, and we just have to change that. So if we're logged in, we want this to say logged or log out, and we want this to be /logout. So now when we click it, I can't remember which group it was, but they were having an issue where when they went to a page that didn't exist, it was saying log out, or sorry, it was saying the index page. Is that another question? No, okay. And the reason for that is inside of here, we need to use if we want it to be the exact path, we use the property of exact. So now, when we're on the login page, there's nothing that actually renders for it, and it just gets rendered. And because how a switch works, what we can do is we can just do path equals, you might even be able to just avoid doing path and just do render. Render equals this, do div, and say 404 page. What am I missing? Oh, there. No, I need to do path. Okay. So now at the last one, it'll just render a 404 page if we for some reason go to a page that does not exist. So I'm just going to push this up, and then we can actually work on the last part of creating and seeing our different classes. So I'm just going to push this up. Git status, git add that. Okay. Okay. So now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be grabbing our classes that already exist in our database. So in order to do this, I'm going to close everything and open up the API for the server. So in here, I'm going to create a file under API called, not client, classes, or yeah, classes.js. And inside of here, inside of our API index.js, I'm going to say router.use on /classes. I want to require the classes file. And that will error out probably in here, yep. Because we are not importing express and then exporting our router object. So now it will work. But what we need to do is we need to import our classes model that we created. So inside of models, we have class. So we want to class equals require from our models folder /class. So when it comes to writing a good API, when you do certain actions, it's expected that it does certain things in a what is called a REST API. So when you use a GET request, you always expect that that data is going to come back the same way every time unless if data has changed. But what I mean by that is if you do a GET request, there usually should not be any side effect. Like you shouldn't be using a GET request and it creates something. That doesn't make sense. And the same thing with doing a POST request. When you do a POST request, you usually expect that it's going to be creating something. So in this case, we're going to do a router.get. And because we're already on /classes, we're just going to use that. And then we're going to do request res next. So in this case, we're going to use class.find by itself because we're using Mongo. And then this is going to be our data. And we want to use res.json on data. So if I open this up in our application, just to show you, go /API/classes. Here is an array of all our classes that we have. So you can see right here, I'm using a plugin that shows you how many is in an array, but we have 8 classes. Now, one thing that's actually pretty important to do is you need to know, like, I can look at this array, but when you're working with multiple pages of stuff, you're never going to return everything. You're going to return a small chunk of it. But you do want to know how many total items there are so that way you can handle some sort of pagination. So in this case, I'm going to use a promise.all, and I'm going to use class.find, and I'm going to use class.find.count documents. When I refresh, so now inside of data, our first promise is going to be returning us our results, and the second one is going to be returning us our total items as a number. So we can do that. And then for res.json, we just want to render our results and total items. So let me one second. ESLint, does this? Sorry. What is this yelling at me in ESLint? There we go. So this will find our documents, and this one will count our documents, and it returns it in the order that we did. So in this case, data is an array, and we just spread out the first value being results, the second item being total items, and then we just respond that back. So now when I refresh this, you'll see results is an array of 8, and then we have total items, which is also 8. So if we were to be in our class page, this is now where we would want to request that resource. So class extends react.component, and we need to use render. And we also need to use a constructor, props, super props, this dot state equals this, and we also need component did mount. Okay. So we've switched it to a class. We need the constructor so that way we can use our state. And we need to use the super props there. And then we also need our component did mount. So in order to make the request, we're going to import Axios into Axios for API call. And then in component did mount, we want to do an axios.get on our API/classes. And then .then for when that's done. And we want the data that's inside of it. And for right now, I'm just going to console.log the data. So grab data from API/classes using our classes route, API route. And then if we refresh this, or not even refresh it, if we just go to /classes, well, maybe we have to refresh it. There is an error. Super expression must be either null or a function. Oh, okay. On your screen, just make sure that when you did react.component that you used a capital C and not a lowercase c, just as a heads up. So now, when I refresh, you can see right here, here's our results that's coming back from our API that we created. So in order to save that, we want to modify our state inside of our class's component. So one thing that you can just do is you can just say, this dot set state and say classes is equal to data. So now inside of here, we just refresh that. And I go into React, grab our page. For classes, you can now see we have state with our results, and here's our results. The only thing with this that is not good to do is we don't have a default value when we start. Because classes is an object, and we're going to be looping over all of our results, we want to have a default option for that. So in this case, we would have classes, and I'm actually going to just set this to being, instead of having classes that is an object that does all that, I'm just going to change it to being results is equal to empty array, total items is null, and is loading is true. So these are the three values that I'm setting in this dot state and setting them to default values. On our component did mount, what I'm then going to do is instead of just setting classes to data, I'm going to do this dot set state, and I'm going to say results is equal to data.results. Total items is equal to data.total items, and is loading is going to be false. So now, if I just refresh this, and grab our classes, you'll now see that results and total items are separate, and then we have an is loading of either being true or false. But now we need to loop over our data. So if I, just to make it look the same as what we used in week 8, I'm going to go to our view for classes and list, and this is our class mixin that is right here. I'm just going to copy all of this that's right here. So inside our class, if I just copy this in as a comment, we had two mixins. We had what was called outline button, and we had our class mixin that took a class. And then we had an h1 tag, a anchor tag that moved us to the /create page, a row, and then for each thing in class, we just rendered the class mixin. So we're going to do something kind of similar. So we're going to use our container. We're going to use an h1 that's right here. So h1, say this is our class list. And we want to have a anchor with a class name of button primary. And an href of classes/create. So if I look at that, that looks pretty similar to what we did before. But what we need to do is render our items as they come in. So in this case, we're going to use a .row. So div class name of row. And then we are going to do this.state.results, or sorry, .results.map. This is going to give us a result. Actually, I'm just going to do that. And now I'm going to copy this. So we need to use a div with a class name of column medium 4. Inside of that, we had a card with margin bottom 4 and a shadow small. Inside of that, we had a card body. Inside of that, we had a paragraph with a card text, which was our course code dash class name. So instead of using underscore course code, we're just going to render it like this. We're going to say result.course code dash result.name. And I'm going to save that. We're not completely done yet, but we can now see that this is going to be rendering to the page. So you can now see that we're rendering our different classes onto the screen in the same way that we were before. So if we take the rest of this and say outside of here we need a div with a class name of deflex with justify content between and align item center. Separate that out. We now need a div with a class name of button group. And then we just need 2 outline buttons, which were just anchor tags. So anchor class name is going to be this. And the href is going to be, we had classes, view, and then ID. I'm going to copy that. So in here we need view and delete. Or I guess we had to edit. Yeah, edit. Okay. So now we have view and edit. If we click it, it brings us to 404 page. And you'll notice that right now we're just using regular anchor tags. So it's actually bringing us to that page and hard refreshing. So I'm going to just save this. We're running a little short on time. So list page for classes, push that up. Now, because this set of code right here is so large, usually what you would do is separate this out into another component just to make it easier, which I'm going to quickly do that. So I'm going to create class item.js under components. I'm going to import React I'm going to say const class item equals props, and I'm just going to copy paste this and export default class item. And change this to being props.courseCode and props.name. So now, instead of having this big chunk of code that's right here, I can just import the class item from our components. And right here, render the class item. I'm missing that. All right. So now, in the similar way that we were using a mixin, now we're just using a component to render what's down here. So what we need to do is make it so that when we when we click view, instead of hard refreshing to this ID, we want to actually use the real ID, but we also want to display it to the screen. So what we'll do is import with router from React router DOM and not React DOM router, and import, when we export our default, we want to wrap our class item in with router. So now our class item gets all the same information that other places that like the page component would get. And we also want to import our link component. So instead of using, I guess we don't actually have to use with router. We can just use link because we have all the information that we need using just the link object. Sometimes you have to use with router to get more router information. So with link, we can route to, and so we want to go to classes, view, and then props.id. And then we want to do the same thing to our other anchor tag. And instead of being view, it's edit. We change the anchor tags to just being a link. So now if I go back and go to classes and I click view, it now goes directly to there, and you'll also see that it's undefined. So it's because it's props._id, no slash, there we go, _ID. And now we can go to it. I'm going to set up the view page. I'm going to grab the same code that we had used before because we're running short on time. Oh, there's so much stuff in here. So those are the students. I don't think we'll have time to get the students in there. So we can also do a page for class detail.js where we will import React, const class, or we'll use a component, class component, class detail extends react.component. and constructor so props, super props, this dot state, render, return, div, okay. So now we have our div there, and we're going to export default class details. Oh, sorry, just class detail. So git status, git add, create class detail / class item, git push. Then inside app, we're going to take the same thing that we did here with our classes, and we're going to do /view. What's the full page? /classes /view /the ID. So in the same way that we did IDs on Node.js, we're going to use an ID with a colon in front of it. And I'm just going to import the page, so class detail, class detail, save that. So our new one is right here. I'm just going to move it, no, that's fine. So inside of here, we're going to have to import our layout from our components layout. Create a div with a class name of container. So let's quickly check this. So the modal we don't need. The only part that we really need is this right here. And we'll render a div with a class name of row, a div with a class name of column mid 8, and one with 4. And here we'll have an h1 that says student list, a button, class name of button primary that says create student. And then for each student in our class, we want to render something. So render students right here. And then here we want to render sidebar. And I can now get rid of this. So with this, our class detail, in the same way that the rest of our application doesn't know the specifics on a class. So we have to set up an API for that, which is pretty similar to what we did for our class in here. The only difference that we're going to do is router.get on /:id, and then we'll use request res next. And instead of doing promise.all, we're just going to do class.find1, or just find by ID. And then we're going to give it our request.params.id. dot then. We're going to have our data, and we're going to do res.json on our data without making any changes to it. So find class by ID using our router params, and then respond back with data as JSON. So if I take this ID that's right here, and right now I've set it up so if I go to API classes, it responds back all the classes, but if I give it an ID after that, it will give me the specific information for that one class. So if I duplicate this and grab a different ID, let's grab, say, this one. This one is networking essentials. I type in this one. It's now programming fundamentals. And same thing with Internet of Things using Arduino. Internet of Things using Arduino. So I'm pretty sure one of these had students in it. This one. So we'll use this one just to display our students as they come back. So I'm going to have to do the same thing that I did in our page for classes. I'm going to do a component did mount. I'm going to import Axios from Axios, doing axios.get on /API /classes / and then this is now where I need the ID. So I'm going to grab the ID from just to show you where this is. I showed it to you before, but we didn't have a good example of it yet. So inside of our class detail, I said that we had our history prop, our location prop, and our match prop. And under match, we have another object called params, and this is very similar to use, instead of using request.params, we have match.params, and it's whatever ID that we used inside of our React router. So in here, I'm just going to do this.props.match.params, and I'm just going to add the ID then the data that comes back, and this set state. And how does this come back? We have a name, some students, term, instructors, course code. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to take everything that we have and just update the entire thing. For defaults, I'm going to have is loading as true. So I'm going to spread data here and then give is loading false. But we need to know that our students is going to be an empty array, instructors is an empty array, course code, and name. I think that's everything. Oh, and term. So inside of here, if we were to render our students, I'm just going to just render out their name using just their first and last name. So I do this .state.students.map. We have a specific student that comes back, and I'll just render a div for each one. And that student is going to have student.firstname followed by a space, and then student.lastname. Cannot read property map of undefined. Let's see. So our students are not rendering. So this dot state dot students dot map console log. Oh, hold on. It's no, that should be right. Let me just try this. Just console log the data as it comes back. Refresh. So the data is coming back. Oh, whoops. I did not open it up. That's why. I did not deconstruct it. So now that should come in and we render the first name and last name of the different students that are in there. So push this up to GitHub. Rendering students based on class. And push that up. So unfortunately, that is the end of our class. Like I said, I will get you guys the document for the expectations for the presentation for the next 2 weeks. Yeah, that's it. So hope you guys have a good weekend.
You as well.